is London Calling. You're listening to me, Tash, on BuccanEar, your source for what they don't want you to know. This time we're turning our focus back on the media to look at my former employer, the GBB. As we know, the broadcaster has been through a lot of changes since the Hassani government gave in to pressure from his corporate backers and privatised the corporation. Today, the GBB is a shadow of its former self. It's become a tool used by the government to circulate fake news and misinformation. So how did we get here? Where did it all go wrong? How can we tell when our national media has become state propaganda? Our experts speak on conditions of anonymity for their own safety. Here's disinformation and media expert Charles, who's seen free broadcasters built up by journalists and torn down by demagogues all over the world.
So before the media fragmented, there was this voice of authority that was trusted and worthy of trust. Then what we ended up with is a really commercial model where whether you're talking about an app on a smart device or whether you're talking about a broadcaster, the most important thing was to keep you in that environment for the longest amount of time possible, and because that meant money in their pocket. And in order to do that, a couple of things happened. One was the use of manipulative techniques around behavioral economics, things that would just keep you scrolling or keep you listening or keep you looking for more information. The second is that kind of environment favors sensationalism. And so you got more sensational headlines and more sensational stories, and it didn't matter whether they were true or not. It just kept people in and it kept them in the loop. So we ended up in a situation where nobody trusted anything and nobody believed anything at all. And that is the perfect environment for an authoritarian voice to come in and say, no, wait, we are the truth. So the ground for this environment really got created when we had suddenly authoritarian politicians everywhere, and anything that threatened them or they disagreed with, they would call it disinformation. That's disinformation, that's fake news. And again, we got in a situation where nobody really believed anything. And the trouble is if you were telling the truth, it's very hard to get your message to cut through all of the noise of all of the disinformation that's there. So like, you'll remember Out on the Edges, there was this story about when they would take a house by force, they would take any infants and they would crucify them. And that's a great, fantastic, viral story. And how do you counter that story? With the truth. The only way you can counter it is by saying, no, they didn't. And of course, no one wants to spread that story. No one wants to hear that story. They want to hear the sensationalism. They want to hear how people were victims of violence when in fact they weren't. Or they were victims of insurgent forces when in fact they weren't.
The news isn't neutral, it's a battleground. Here's media researcher and academic Alfie.
The media has, of course, been perhaps the key way in which governments have controlled and influenced their populations. So, totalitarian countries have typically used huge mainstream media outlets to sell one kind of news, one kind of biased news to its population. Of course, the media has always played this kind of key role in methods of state control. I think what's happening now is perhaps even more concerning, where you previously, in pre-crisis Britain, we had perhaps more diverse voices in the media, but now with the GBB, you're really only seeing one brand of news and therefore only getting one truth. So people end up with a very biased and controlled idea of the reality and the world that we're actually living in. There was, of course, many concerns and many problems, but in a way there were some positive things that, like, not all information was coming from one place, and so you'd have kind of far-right media outlets developing and then left-wing media outlets developing to combat those and kind of challenge the mainstream newspapers, TV stations, radios, and make sure people were questioning the validity and truth of the information they were receiving. So whilst there was the digital afforded more fake information, it also makes us suspicious and skeptical of information and makes us question the information we're getting. And I think in pre-crisis Britain, it might not have seemed great at the time, but there was something positive about that there was a lot of distrust in the media and in the different kinds of truths that were being told. Whereas now, I think you're seeing a return to a more traditional and older pre-digital sense, actually, of people just trusting what they're told, and that's why we have to be here with radio stations like this to challenge those conceptions. Most citizens feel pretty hopeless, I think, and unable to fight back against these kind of huge mainstream corporations that simply entrench and support the ideals and ideologies of the state. It can seem very hopeless indeed, but I think, the fact that you're out there listening, we're in here talking, shows that there is still a space to combat these false truths and disinformation that's being sold to us, and that it's never possible really to completely shut down, despite all the technologies that they have at their disposal and all the financial and corporate power and all the physical power. It's never quite possible to shut down people's desire to get to the truth and fight for their own ideologies and values, and we're out here starting that task, so don't give up hope.
You've been listening to BuccanEar with me, Tash. We'll be back soon with more of what you'll never hear on the GBB. Keep listening, keep sharing, and keep resisting.